Thanks, Jeff. Well, I wanted to tell a couple stories about how I got connected with you guys. I've worked in environmental engineering almost 27 years, doing a lot of wastewater, well, we call it clean water consulting. I'm a treatment engineer, work a lot on wastewater treatment plants, but many of my projects have also worked on water resources, water supply, water treatment, all kinds of things. And I'm a past president of the Pacific Northwest Clean Water Association, and that's one avenue that where I got connected with all of you. The second avenue is just observing what was happening here in the US around in the early 2000s. The Kyoto Accord had been signed. I noticed that Japan, Europe, Australia were spending big money on reducing their carbon footprint, but in the US we were firmly entrenched in a state of denial. And so I thought, there are these two opposite things going on, and I knew where to look to find the answer to it. And it's really all my dad's fault that I love science. I knew where to look, because he was biology professor at the College of Idaho in Caldwell. I grew up in Idaho. And he used to leave science and nature lying around the bathroom, and everybody knows that the bathroom is where you find your best reading material. So I started looking it over when I was a kid, and I knew where to pick it back up again. So I've explained to people many times in my group that this is just a science question. I recently got my Washington PE. I've had my Idaho PE for decades, actually. And the Engineers Code of Ethics crossed my path again, and I'm always glad to see it. It says that engineers in their fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. I love that. This last bullet is new. I hadn't seen that before, but we're also encouraged, just encouraged, to protect the environment for future generations. Interesting. So, put both of them together. As past president of PNCWA, I work a lot with cities, utilities, and that's a large clean water professional organization where decision makers hang out, and I just realized how important it is to talk to these people about climate change and make sure it gets integrated into the thought process. So I invited Phil Mote and Paul Fleming in 2012 to speak at opening session about is it happening, why, what does this mean for cities and utilities? And then a large list of other scientists have spoken there in the last 4 years. So I love this quote by Cousteau: "The cycle of life is intricately joined with the cycle of water." So I like to classify human beings into freshwater and saltwater species. So I've worked all over the US. I'm a national resource in disinfection, and hopefully soon in climate change as these projects keep developing. Many of the cities I've worked with are on coasts, so saltwater cities, freshwater cities, quite a bit too. And I just thought I'd address the question, does one of these species, saltwater or freshwater, do they understand the science better than the other species? Well, I don't really think so, because most people don't even read the science. I'm just talking about the general public. And for the most part, I think it's a popularity contest still. You know, when I'm in Seattle and Portland quite a bit these days, and I was at my Seattle cousin, who's a high school teacher, I was at one of her parties, and the general consensus was climate change is happening, fluoridation of the water is bad, that's counter to what the science indicates. And when I'm in Portland, you wouldn't believe the people that come out of the woodwork to oppose filtering the water supply to meet the surface water treatment rule, which is really a good idea for protecting public health. So it's crazy. But it is interesting that the larger cities have deeper resources. They often employ experts in climate and water resources issues. And that is the case, and I think that's the reason why Portland and Seattle are leaders in addressing climate change. Several Northwest utilities have strategic climate action plans. Of course, King County, Seattle area, Portland BES, many others. And I wanted to just tell you about a project I'm helping to develop with a friend, an old friend who's now manager of one of the divisions at Portland BES. The project is called Resiliency Consultant Analysis and Implementation Strategy. Very interesting. It's mostly dealing with climate. It has a seismic aspect too that is being addressed by Portland Water Bureau. So the idea is to integrate climate impacts into their asset management system. And when I say asset management, that's maintenance, equipment replacement, new projects having to do with wastewater assets, pump stations, collection systems, treatment plants, stormwater systems, water supply systems, mostly all the water stuff. Because transportation, that's ODOT, who takes care of that. So what we've talked about quite a bit, I mean, you can talk about warmer temperatures, and they're important for a variety of reasons, but the big worry in Portland and Seattle is flooding. So precipitation from peak storm events is on their mind. So what are we going to use for design criteria? In the old days, we'd use historical data, but that now is of questionable value. I hear more and more about intense storm events hitting Portland's West Hills. And I believe that's where atmospheric rivers travel. The Pineapple Express uses that route. It doesn't hit Gresham so much, that's east of the Willamette River, so interesting. But we need to update the intensity, duration, frequency curves for storm events. So that's the main thing I think that cities and utilities need from climate research is better, more specific precipitation projections. And I know this is probably asking a lot. I know everybody, well, the climate researchers, from what I've heard, feel much more comfortable with temperature projections, not so much with precipitation. And especially when you're getting down to IDF curves. But never hurts to ask, that's what they need. I also should mention that I do realize there's a lot of overlap between what you guys do and what we consultants, engineers, and scientists do. There are many firms who have climate scientists on staff to run models and stick their necks out and try to make some projections. But for these projections to be meaningful, it would be helpful if it's more than just a Pacific Northwest projection for precip. Projections on the city level would be great. Portland area projections would be great. But when it comes down to neighborhood level, that would really be helpful so that we don't upsize the pipes in Gresham to match the size of the pipes in the West Hills when it won't really be used. Temperature projections are important so that we can protect fish and aquatic species. And they're also important to protect, so we can design electrical rooms and electrical systems to withstand the heat. The photo here is of Mapleton, Oregon, just this spring. They had a nice flood. So heavy precip events are happening more frequently. Washington and Oregon are seeing more flooding. Vernonia is a client of ours at Tetra Tech in Portland. They had 200-year precip events within a 10-year period. And they're now we're designing and constructing facilities to withstand the 500-year flood. That's the old definition of the 500-year flood, just for fun. So at this year's PNCWA conference, which just ended last week, we were talking about integrated watershed management, and that is something that Portland BES project will hedge into as well. It's not just precip events, that stormwater that I was talking about, it's the rivers receiving waters of the treatment plants and stormwater. That's a water source for the water treatment facilities, or for Bull Run, well, Bull Run Reservoir isn't actually connected to a river. Water supply issues will come into play with decreasing snowpack, droughts, and those are spur water reuse projects, so treated wastewater to use for irrigation or, heaven forbid, drinking water. Sea level rise is an issue for Seattle. They are looking at it, but it's less of an issue than flooding, according to them. So this integrated watershed management is looking at the big picture of everything, the one water concept, where all flows are resources rather than nuisances to be managed. And it recognizes the interconnectedness of snowpack, groundwater, surface water, wastewater, stormwater, and seawater. So climate resiliency planning does have a lot to do with adaptation planning, but it's so important to also mitigate. And I'm glad to see that there are a few treatment plants installing large solar arrays and utilizing their digester gas. Digester gas, this is the solids from the wastewater process. They produce methane as they go through the stabilization process. And they're used, that natural gas is used to power the treatment plant. The Gresham treatment plant is now energy neutral. It was the second wastewater treatment plant in the US to become energy neutral. The first was East Bay Municipal Utility District in California. Boulder, Colorado, my old client, also has the solar array and biogas utilization. It seems to be a popular approach. And that's no small thing, because the treatment plant is usually the city's biggest energy user, but they can be the city's biggest energy producer. When I went to Gresham just a month ago, I sat down with the treatment plant superintendent, who's actually an old friend from Idaho, and he showed me the numbers. They produced 400 megawatts in September. So last weekend, Portland had a 2-inch, 24-hour rainfall event, and it created flooding in the lower sections of the light rail lines, the MAX lines. So more than a dozen trains were offline this week for inspection. Some of them had damage due to the flooding, and I just love these photos. They actually drove through this. I mean, some of the operators said, you know, we've got feet of water on the tracks, and they were told, well, keep going. So a Portland streetcar spokeswoman said there were so many leaves on the ground. Oh yeah, it was leaves plugging the storm drains. And then the monsoon rains hit. So my question is, shouldn't we design for climate change when we're planning our infrastructure? It's just hilarious. So temperature, I hate to pick on the light rail system because Portland actually is far advanced compared to other cities when it comes to mass transit, which deals with climate change. But their light rail system, because of its age, it was designed and built to operate at an average high temperature of 55 degrees. Now that we're seeing the high temperatures, especially the past couple of years, operators have to watch for both sagging power lines and sun-kinked rails when it's hot, so they slow down the trains. So I wanted to just mention this. When I was moving from Boise to Portland, I ran across a stack of articles. I always clip things and save them for presentations. One of the articles is from PE Magazine, and a well-known engineer said, if 10 years from now your structure fails or your light rail fails, due to a climate event, one of the questions could be, did you take climate change into account in your design? A follow-up article from this year said, well, the standard of care is changing as this whole climate change and engineering design develops. The author of this more recent article said, well, what David Lapp suggested in his quote, we need to design around climate change. Maybe that's asking a lot of engineers as something that's going to happen immediately, but we should at least be liable for having a professional conversation with our clients about what's happening and do they want to consider climate change in their designs. One of the things that cities and utilities need from you, and I think the general public, we need for all of us to talk to them. Some decision makers at cities and utilities still don't understand that climate change is happening. Many don't understand the scientific method. And one quote recently is, "I think climate change is happening. That's my opinion. Not everybody shares my opinion." Like, well, it's just a science issue. It's not an opinion issue. We need for you to talk to them about adapting and mitigating. We don't want to have our solutions create a worse climate scenario in the future. As I was talking to an engineer from Portland BES, and this guy just manages the collection system. He was so well informed on climate change, I couldn't believe it. And here's the list that we talked about that cities and utilities need to hear from climate research. What does our climate future look like? How out of equilibrium is our energy imbalance? How much climate change have we already committed to with our greenhouse gas emissions? What do we have to do to reach equilibrium? And what would that new climate look like? This is my grab bag of other needs. I'm going to just breeze over it, but it includes forest fires too. And when you're talking to the public, a little humor goes a long way. I always try to explain the effects of climate change on Man on a Desert Island cartoons. I think that's an important point. So we have time for a couple questions.
Thank you.
So I work with a number of municipal wastewater treatment providers and municipal systems, and one of the issues they're confronting as mid-sized and small cities is they're kind of caught in this vice of decreasing river inflows for their minimum design flows. At the same time, they're urging water conservation that's increasing the concentration of the pollutants. And they're both driven by climate change, and they're not quite sure how to get out of the trap.
I think it's interesting that we're seeing lower flows at wastewater treatment plants and higher concentrations. And in a way, it makes it so we get to design smaller hydraulic structures, but we have to be smart about the treatment processes that we use for those facilities. And it is always harder for the small to mid-sized facilities. And part of it comes back to a regulatory question, which I can't address, but I think using sophisticated, well-informed engineers who can come up with these, who have access to and are informed about the new treatment processes that are available is really helpful. But also having conversations with regulators about what's practical for smaller plants. That would be helpful in the long run. Yes?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Steve Klein. I work for EPA's Office of Research and Development in Corvallis, Oregon. And my question is this, updating these IDF curves to give a better sense of what the future climate might hold as far as storm intensity, duration, frequency, is part of the solution, but it really doesn't get at variability, and it doesn't get at the extreme events. And so, can you tell me how an engineer can take that notion and that uncertainty and be able to offer a range of design standards or criteria that address certain levels of risk, and be able to communicate both those specifications and then the level of risk that will or will not be addressed?
That is such a good question, and I've been talking recently to Portland BES and to Seattle Public Utilities folks about that. And that's, as far as projects go, that's new space. This Portland BES project probably hasn't been done by anyone in the US yet. So we're just figuring that out. And when I talked to Jennifer, my client at BES, we talk about, well, what do we do if we don't have these projections, and how can we have anything solid in those areas? Do we take an old design criteria and multiply by 3 or multiply by 5? We're still up in the air on being able to answer that question.
Great, thank you.
take one more?
Dr. Stephen Lake, working for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and I'm brand new on this topic, and I'm working on climate adaptation strategies for the tribe. My question is somewhat political in dealing with engineers and implementers and managers. I'm a botanist. Is it better to gain public support for positions or knowledge in various potential positions before talking to managers and engineers, or after talking to managers and engineers?
That's a good question. I think both. Whoever you can talk to, you should talk to, because even though engineers and managers should get it, a lot of the times they don't. Like I've heard somebody say, Phil Mote has his opinion, Rush Limbaugh has his opinion, and it's like, well, Phil Mote and thousands of other scientists around the world, and really the high school graduate? So they need information from all of us. And public support is great to garner. I think we need to just have those conversations at the parties with the teachers. But I strongly encourage talking to engineers and decision makers as much as possible as well.
Okay, thank you, Cindy.